Hey class, so today I'm going to be talking about Sarah and Bree's vlogs. They both kind of took a similar pattern as mine did, where I talked about the American Savior narrative in Between Shades of Grey. Sarah and Bree talked about Within These Lines by Stephanie Morrill, and they kind of touched on a lot of the same things that I did with propaganda and how America's public perception was kind of altered by what they were shown in the media and what they were shown in the news. And Sarah talked about a lot of racial issues that were happening and Within These Lines. And she touched on Evelina's mob heritage. And I talked a little bit about this in my discussion last week on the discussion thread. And I kind of took issue with that aspect of Evelina's character because it shows a lot of racial stereotyping around Italians. It kind of shows that, oh, Evelina is Italian, so she must have ties to the mob. And I thought that that inclusion was a little bit strange considering the tones that Morrill took in the rest of the novel, touching on the racist practices in America towards Japanese Americans. So it kind of stuck like a strange note to me. I just thought that it was a little bit weird that Morrill would deconstruct the narrative around Japanese Americans being discriminated against while still upholding these stereotypes towards Italians. That was just a little bit strange to me, but I liked that Sarah brought that up. And Sarah also talked about Italians versus Japanese people, like how Italians were racist towards the Japanese Americans, even though the Italians were still in the Axis powers. Just like the Japanese were, they were still in the opposite side against the Americans in World War II. But why were Italians still being so racist against Japanese Americans? And this kind of boils down less to politics and more to just racism, straight up racism, in America at this time. And in one of the secondary articles on History.com, it says that DeWitt's original plan included Italians and Germans, though the idea of rounding up Americans of European descent was not as popular. So this shows basically why this was happening, why the Italians were not being discriminated against to the same degree as Japanese Americans because they were not of European descent. And just like Sarah was talking about, this really boils down to a racial issue, not a political issue. And she also touches on the legalization of discrimination and how that's kind of embedded into our American history. Racism is literally in our historical laws, with these internment camps especially. And I thought that that was an interesting inclusion because it shows, like I was talking about in my vlog, that it kind of deconstructs this narrative that America is so morally superior. Since they did have this problematic history of institutionalized racism and racism by law. So I thought that was a great inclusion, Sarah. And Sarah also talked about propaganda, and she said, like, look how great they have it here. That was kind of the message that the public was given about the Japanese internment camps. And Brie also touched on the importance of propaganda in public's perception of events. And I thought that that was really just interesting to look into because I also saw in Between Shades of Grey that propaganda was a big issue, and that as well as in just the Holocaust and everything that was happening throughout the entire world at this time. And Sarah also talked about how the Japanese internment camps really just enforced segregation. They didn't really do anything to put a stop to this kind of radical Japanese allegiance. It really just was to separate people from the rest of the European Americans. Because they didn't put a stop to the Black Dragons, they didn't put a stop to the death list, they just kind of let that happen. But what the real goal was to do was to just separate. Japanese Americans from the rest of the public, from European Americans. And to segue into Bhri's vlog, she kind of started out by talking about how California is set to apologize for the internment camps that happened within these lines. And I thought that was interesting that they're, even today, still apologizing for it, because it took them so long for the United States government as a whole to apologize for it. So I think it's just important that it's still going on, that we're still talking about it in our public discourse. But she also brings up that the Italians were also in the Axis powers, like I was talking about earlier, but yet they were the ones who were discriminating against the Japanese Americans, largely. Even in Evelina's family, she was still experiencing that discrimination towards members of Taichi's family, towards the Hamasakis, and others of Japanese descent. And Bhri also brings up propaganda and how it was kind of used to bolster American spirit by swaying people to see an event in a particular way, as she puts it. And I think that is really vital to understanding how these internment camps were allowed to happen for so long, how they were kind of buried within history, because Moral at the end, she discusses how her Nana lived in California at this time, and she thought that the Japanese Americans loved being in internment camps because that is what she was being fed by the public, that is what she was being told by the media and the news. And Bhri brought up, a picture of a piece of propaganda that was given to the public during the time of the Japanese internment camps. And I really thought that was interesting because it puts us in perspective. It puts us into that time period. And it shows us what people were being shown, not just what we're reading about, not just what we see in history. But it kind of bridges the gap between the 21st century and what was happening in the 1940s. It makes us kind of be forced to live in that moment by experiencing that piece of propaganda. And Bhri also mentioned how propaganda was used to silence people. But I thought that it was important to mention that Evelina, through her articles and through her kind of advocacy towards the Japanese Americans, kind of fought against that discourse, that idea that propaganda is kind of the end-all be-all of what the public is seeing. Evelina is trying to fight that. She's trying to show the public what is really happening. And of course she faces backlash, but she understands that what she's doing is more than her. What she's doing is changing the narrative around a piece of history. So I thought that aspect of Evelina's character was just really interesting because it's more than herself. And I think that's also prevalent in between these lines with Lena. What she's doing, what she's drawing is more than herself. She's using it to show the public in generations to come what actually happened to her. Just like Evelina is showing generations, even her own generation, but also those after her, what actually happened to the Japanese Americans in this time of internment camp and this time of discrimination. So I really loved both of your vlogs, and it was really nice to listen to them. Thanks for listening.